being able to churn out some top-notch debaters. My name is Daniel. I'm from New Zealand, and I'm one of the CAs of this tournament.
And I am Jessica. I'm from the Australian National University in Australia. Also one of the CAs, joining Daniel. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, so what we're going to do today is we're going to walk through 3 things in this seminar, as well as answering, of course, any questions that you have. If you're watching via the Facebook live stream, just leave a comment there and that will be passed on via copy-paste to the Zoom chat. And of course, if you have any questions, you can just throw it in the Zoom chat or ask us after or raise your hands and we can call on you. We're very flexible in terms of how we receive questions in the seminar. The 3 things we're going to discuss is firstly talk about institution building. And what we mean by that is just putting together the groups and networks and structures, but by which people can be supported in becoming better debaters, that's useful to implement from the society administrative perspective. The second thing we'll discuss is the tools, a couple of tools that are quite useful for helping people develop. And we'll look at 5 exercises and activities that you can do in the development context that are useful for firstly building up beginner debaters, introducing them to the activity, making sure that they've got some of those fundamentals down, and then secondly some more specific targeted activities that you can either do in a group or individually as a more advanced speaker looking to build more advanced members of your teams. And then finally we'll discuss pro-am tournaments. In particular, what is useful for you to do as a pro debater in terms of wanting to build up your AM, really maximize that experience for them and then hopefully for you as well. And then at the end, just some general tips on how you as an institution can run those programs and make sure that people are well supported throughout them. So I think we can just dive in unless anyone has any dramatic opening questions for us and look at how you can build institutions within your debating society. Because I think sometimes debating can fall prey a little bit to the great person mythology where you have individual debaters who are able to perform exceptionally well. But I think one of the things that is often missed is that these people come through development institutions where they're particularly well supported, and often they give back to those institutions. So the first thing that I will note, if you are someone who works in the administration of a society and you're trying to figure out how to build development programs that help you build that pipeline for talented young debaters, the first and I think most important thing to keep in mind is that you are not just developing speakers, you are developing judges. And I think developing judges who can go to your club nights, who can help out at practice events, that's the precondition to developing speakers and giving every speaker, especially younger speakers at your institution, access to good training as a judge, gives them a background to debating that is incredibly useful for them developing as they get forward. So what I'd first note here is that there's a couple of neat things that you can do to help build up your judging institutions. And the first is to make sure that all of your materials for judges are very accessible. Say, for example, pointing them towards the world's judging manuals that exist. These are actually incredibly helpful documents that are designed to guide people when they're being introduced to judging, or some of the finer, more theoretical parts of judging that really sets aside average judges from really exceptional judges by how well they're able to access and know that material. And then the second thing that I would say is that a lot of the ideas about how you develop good judges can kind of exist in the abstract, but the more useful stuff that actually happens with judges comes from the personal connections those judges make and how they're able to put those ideas in practice. And I would actually advise you to have explicit programs that seek to help people who are wanting to become better judges, places where they can come and ask questions of older judges, having buddy programs if someone is new to a society and wants to go train a couple of tournaments, making sure that there's an older judge that through the scope of that tournament, they can come back to and run ideas past and say, hey, I got this feedback. How does this fit into everything that I've been learning? Developing that judge squad vibe, which is often something that we make sure we extend to speakers, but leave a little bit behind when developing judges, is just very important for developing that social and network aspect of judging. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Jess?
Yeah, no, I think that's really good points. I think I would just add that I think it's really important that societies really recognize judges and treat the accomplishments of judges sort of as equally important of those as debaters. Otherwise, obviously, people will naturally not want to continue judging because it doesn't have the same prestige. So I think anything that societies can do to really elevate the status of that judging, and just things that are like incredibly obvious, right? Like if you've got a pool of funding and you're distributing it for a tournament, use it equitably. Don't just, give it to your debaters. And I guess the final thing I would say is that I think it's good to develop good judges in and of themselves. Obviously, it's important for societies. They then get good judges, good feedback. But so many people have asked me what's like one of the main things I can do to get better as a debater. And I say it's to go judge, because then you look at debates and you're forced to critically analyze why something isn't persuasive, and that can help inform your own arguments. So if you're a debater that is looking to improve, go do some judging. But important, as Daniel said, to foster societies, encouraging that. So, but yeah.
So the next few things that we're going to talk about are useful also to judges, but can be expanded a little bit to also thinking about speakers. And well, three or four things that I want to say set apart really good development programs from programs that are yet to become good and can become good if they are listening to this excellent seminar. And the first is to say is that I think it's very useful to make sure that you specifically set aside someone on your executive whose specific role it is to focus on development, to do things like put together guides and help facilitate practices, because it can become a little bit lost in just the mists of friendship that kind of exist around debating. It's very easy for us to just use proxies like, oh, I know a couple of people, I'm going to put together a practice event. I know people I can go and ask questions. And of course, that's wonderful if you're with that bubble, but you want to be pushing that bubble out and making it as accessible for everyone within your institution, even if they're a little bit newer to that institution, to have access to those types of development pathways. And so I think the second corollary recommendation is to put together a practice group, or a group in which people can contribute to, and make sure you make a new one yearly. And that just allows people, as they join in for a new year and are active or unactive that year, they can join in and use it as a space to which they can organize practices, or if there's particularly good debates, especially debates that have been like featured someone from your institution, you can share that in and make sure that people are engaged and have access to that. And of course, I think a good point that Jess mentioned to me is that there's a lot of existing SPAR groups that happen. And of course, as someone who's newer to debating, it can be quite confronting to take the leap into using those ones. So having those smaller groups is a good stepping stone, but can also be a good way to then become the trampoline that they use into those larger groups. Say, for example, finding a teammate, and then with that teammate being able to go to a larger group and trying to branch out. So make sure that if you're a development officer, you're tag teaming with development officers from institutions that are close to you, which I think brings me once again very neatly to the third idea, and that's to make sure that you set up exchanges with other institutions, because I think there's a rising tide lift all boats approach that sets apart really exceptional circuits from circuits that develop insular successful institutions, but weaker institutions around them. And cities, for example, like Sydney, where you've got a whole bunch of different universities who have different independent institutions and societies, but still practice with each other heaps, still form those engagements. That's kind of a model for how you can be successful as a circuit. And of course, everything being online makes that so much more accessible. So as an executive, there's nothing stopping you from literally reaching out to a society you're close to and saying, hey, let's set up a formal institution by which people from our society can practice with members of your society, that we can share resources, that we can build our collective institutions, so we can know someone when we go to tournaments, that we can buddy up people from different institutions and continue to build those ties. Using exchanges is a very useful way to just build up everyone within your institution, and do it while building up another institution and forming a relationship that you can benefit from for many years. And then the final thing that I want to mention is this is quite like a technical point about when you hold like development seminars or development sessions. One of the biggest things that needs to be done, especially with younger debaters, is to make them feel comfortable taking the step from going to a seminar, listening to a seminar and speaking in a debate and wanting to come back because they've had a fun time. And the model that we found works best specifically in New Zealand is to have a seminar as the first thing you do in the evening or earlier in the evening. Anyone who wants can come and watch, and it's a very chill environment. They don't need to talk to anyone right away. They can just breathe in the environment of the debating while learning some of those technical aspects. Have something social like a shared meal or pizza or something after that event where people can informally ask questions or get to know people, and then have a debate after that where hopefully people will after that experience feel a little bit more comfortable speaking. They're not being thrown into debating straight away, but also it gives them an opportunity where they can start using the things that they learn in those earlier sessions with the friends that they've made in that social situation where they readily have development material that they can talk about or bond over when they're feeling awkward. And of course, almost most of the people in this room will have very strong memories of what it was like to be awkward at a first couple of club nights. So just making that environment as inviting as possible, and making sure that it's an environment in which they can learn as much as possible and put those learnings into practice. We found that is a very good setup for how you establish those development institutions.
And I would sort of further add that I guess in the online era and with COVID, that's getting trickier, right? And I think a lot of I've seen like debate series posting threads about how that social kind of vibe can be achieved, in the current environment. And there were a lot of great ideas about like games you can play. I think you suggested some, Daniel. I don't know, people playing Among Us, Scribblio, or whatever, different code games and whatnot. Even if it's just like a 20-minute thing before you're, could be add another dimension, or just have that same thing run, and then people are just sitting around eating their own dinner. It's not the same, but, you're trying to replace or come as close to that environment as much as possible. I've seen as well, I think with a lot of Sydney-based institutions, them running, similar to what you were saying, running joint internals, because for a lot of small societies, obviously, they don't quite have the numbers to necessarily get one debate, per week by themselves, but maybe with another society or a third society, they can get 2 or 3 rooms, which is really great. So I think that society collaboration is definitely a great step. And as well, if you're not sure whether, if you want to go to that next step, as Daniel said, and maybe reach out to a SPA group, we can point you in the direction of people that are involved with those. It sort of sounds a bit scary if you don't know where to start, but if you sort of think, I've done what I can with my society, but I want to like reach out to others, then you just got to try to find someone. And if they don't know, they'll probably know someone who knows, and they can point you in the right direction.
Yeah.
Oh no, you go.
No.
Oh, you just cut out for a second, I think.
Oh, sorry. After you.
Oh no, oh sorry. And the other thing I was just going to say finally is that this like all sounds so incredibly obvious, but development and societal, and building a strong debating society, obviously underpinning all of that is just one that is welcoming and nurturing. And at the risk of being a bit self-serving, myself and a few others wrote an article not too long ago, which we posted in Debate Series posting, about mental health issues in debating and sort of how to foster that nurturing environment. And if you haven't, please check it out, because I think at the end of the day, development goals are great, but they're not going to be achieved if people are not feeling positive about debating. So obviously all the more important as a society to not just, directing them to judge resources, but resources about how they can be supported obviously goes sort of hand in hand. So that was the only thing I was going to add.
So I think the next thing that we'll do is, obviously we've given lots of tips about the structures of development seminars, but it can be quite confronting to set them up, because obviously a lot of people who do debating are pretty self-taught. It's about going to lots of debates, doing lots of debates, receiving lots of feedback, thinking about that feedback, and it can be a little bit difficult to think about debating as like actually something that can be taught and really thought about and coached. So what we thought we'd do in the middle section of this seminar is just walk through some of the activities you can run with teams, or you can run by yourself in order to improve the accessibility of debating to people who are coming in, or to hone particular skills as a more advanced debater. And I think one of the things that's useful about these activities is they can be implemented, I think, basically at every level of development. You can run them as like large events where people come together and just know that other people are doing these activities, and then learning from their experiences doing it. At the other end of the spectrum, it can just be something you do entirely by yourself. And I do a lot of like, I've included some of my favorite things to do, like especially if I'm warming up for a tournament, the types of exercises that I do to make sure that my like debating brain is on and activated, or it can be part of a broader development series that you are doing. So giving people particular goals to engage in these activities every so often, and then being able to check in with other people who are engaging in a similar development program, and want to be able to use those tools to advance. So what we've got is two tools that are quite useful for beginners or introducing people to some of the fundamentals of debating in a way that is non-confrontational and open, and I think quite fun and engaging. And then secondly, we've got three particular tools that can be used by advanced debaters, rather than just giving speeches, as a ways to create some variety in the way that you train or push your development. So in terms of the beginner activities or tools, I have two games that I love to play with the crop of new debaters who comes through Auckland. I'm sure many of you will have the same experience where your first club night, your first event, there's just like lots of people who it is unlikely will ever come back to debating. And so what you want to give them is a reason to come back, but also an introduction to some of the things that makes debating really crucial, and hopefully start setting the foundations for them to become outstanding debaters as early as possible. So the two games that I like to play with beginners is firstly the comparative and framework game. And this really works on motion interpretation and meta debating or frameworking of debates in a way that really introduces people to what I think is key and interesting about debating as opposed to any other intellectual activity, is that it's a lot about manipulating certain quite constrained parameters, the words of the motion, the meta and strategy of the debate. That's what sets it aside from just like writing an essay. And so that's the first game I like to play, and the second is the extension game, which is essentially, it's kind of what it means. It's about introducing people to the concept of extensions and the two rules that govern it: the rule that you can't contradict your earlier team, and the rule that you can't be derivative or benefit from being derivative of those materials. So I'll just walk you through those two activities and how they can play out in a big room, lots of beginners, everyone all over the place. How is this something that's going to be useful? So the comparative and framework game. When I'm teaching debating to people who are entirely new, these are the two concepts I introduce them to first. The comparative, obviously, is all debates are about comparing one thing with another thing. And it's about proving that one world or one set of policies is preferable to another set of policies. And especially beginner debaters just don't think about the comparative. They don't think about, we're comparing two different things. They just think, why is this thing bad, why is this thing good? And that obviously leaves them vulnerable to a whole range of things that can happen in the meta work of debating. And then in terms of framework, it's about, the example that I use is in actor debates, because that's where it's most obvious. It's about constructing, how does this person make decisions? What are things that we care about? But it's actually key for any debate. It's thinking about pathways to victory. What are the different arguments that I need to prove to come to the final decision I want to establish for the judge that allows me to win the debate? And the comparative and framework game is really easy. All you do is you split them up into lots of different groups, or you can have some of them be F and some of them be neg, and have them in like rough groups of 4 or 5 in pairs. And then you shout a motion out to them like, this house would legalize all drugs. And you tell them, okay, you need to come up with comparatives. And by comparatives, not just like what the most obvious comparative is, figuring out what the best comparative is for your team and the worst comparative is for your team. So introducing them to the idea that the comparatives are something that's contested or flexible. If you are, say, in a motion about like legalizing all drugs, is the comparative full prohibition? Is the comparative going to be something more like criminal decriminalization or regulation? What are the parameters that can be played with the worlds there? And then obviously with the framework, getting them to think about what are the things that are most important. If you're on the negating team, what are the things that are the most important you're going to try and teach me or teach the adjudicator, and try and press the importance of the adjudicator? And what I think this game is very useful for is when people come into debating as beginners, they get so locked into just like making arguments or trying to convince you of one particular point that they kind of lose the forest for the trees. And it's really fun in this game when someone gets too attached to a particular argument or a particular train of thought, getting to pull them back and be like, no, make sure that you're just doing your basics. What is the comparative? How can you use it in a way that is favorable to your team? What are they going to do? I have lost an unimaginable number of debates where I've just been stupid about the comparative, and they've been like, well, obviously we wouldn't do that ridiculous way that you wanted to set up. We do it in this different way that solves 9 out of the 10 problems you set up, because like, duh. So getting them to think about that is obviously a hugely important aspect of debating. And it just starts them thinking about motion interpretation and strategic aspects of debating in a way that's quite non-confrontational, because there's lots of people around, lots of people shouting arguments. You can line them up in rows and you can get them to go along and be like, how would you think about the comparative that has just been presented by the AF team before you? What would you adjust? How has it shifted your thinking? And you can get that interplay between the teams, but also keeping those contained units so people feel a little bit more comfortable discussing in those small groups. The extension game is quite similar. I get the big room, depending on how big, maybe I set up multiple layers of this, where I have like 5 or 6 people be opening opposition, opening government, closing opposition, closing government. And then what you do is you essentially just walk through a debate with them in those teams, but instead of running like an actual debate, you just get them to present an opening case or an opening argument, give them one to say, what is your comparative, what is your framework, what would you be arguing in this debate? And then you get your closing team to explain, okay, with that, what would you be extending on? So what is an argument that you think they didn't miss, that they didn't hit, but is open, A, because it is not contradictory, and B, because it is not derivative. And this game, I think, is essential just for teaching debaters what it means for something to be a contribution, because often the specificities of, say, for example, inward extension, or what you're allowed to argue in, or make something non-derivative, that can be lost to someone who is just entering debating when they can't see it playing out in front of them. And I think this is actually an activity that people have quite a lot of fun in, because it forces them as little groups to try and come up with arguments just in the same way that an extension will operate, that fits within the argument that has come before, but is able to be explained as something that is different or something that is extension, be it an inward, outward, or, and I think this is a fun variation of the game, a responsive extension where you play it speaker by speaker. You get the OG to present their case, the OO to explain their case, and then give them an opportunity to respond to each other, and then get the closing teams to try and find new responses, and then explaining to them that those responses are extension material that is worthy of having time invested in them, and you can explain it as a contribution. So what that just does is it takes the quite confronting aspects of extensions, makes it way more accessible, makes it quite a lot more fun for people who have just entered debating, because they can do it in a large group. None of them are feeling particularly on the spot. You can really direct things from the front by saying, have you thought about this? And then everyone can have a little think about that. And it makes them start to think about the specificities of extensions in a way that's mostly just lost on them. If they just do a debate and then they get like wrecked by some team that's a little bit more advanced than them. Did anyone have any questions about how these beginner activities work?
Well, I was actually going to ask you, Daniel, like how you sort of touched on it, like how interventionist you or other senior members in the society are in the game in terms of directing people.
So I like to place senior members if I've managed to whip them along to come to my development seminar for beginners. And sometimes I understand it's not the most fun activity for the more senior debaters, but you wanted to generate a squad vibe where that is seen as something that is fun. You can place them with the groups as in like an overseeing function, so they're there to answer questions, they're there to ask provoking questions of their own, but it's really about hammering in those basics. And a lot of what you're doing is correction. So what will happen is if you're playing the extension game and you've heard like a decent OG case, and then the closing government wants to run something that they've become very attached to and they really want to run it, but you have to explain to them, unfortunately, that is contradictory or that is derivative. Or you ask the other team, what do you think the problem with that extension is? Why don't you think that extension fits within the rules of debating? And then you get that criticism across groups and you're able to guide it with those final conclusions. And then obviously with opening cases, it's also incredibly impressive to all of these people if you're able to whip out like 6 extension ideas. So you also get to have a little bit of a brainstorm and then just show them how much was left in the debate at the end of doing each motion. I think that's a very useful way of starting to give them those like that little bit of fuel that is necessary to show them how much is left within debates after they've dealt with it on a surface level. And the last thing I'd say is it's actually good to cycle through motions pretty quickly. You don't want to do one motion to death. What this is about establishing some of the fundamental like principles and trade-offs of debating in a way that is accessible and isn't just throwing people into doing debates directly. It's about building up that initial knowledge in a way that is like a lot of fun, and then throwing a bunch of like wild ideas. They don't need to be balanced, of course. Like none of these motions are actually being debated. So you can just set motions that you think are interesting and then teach teams about the difficulties of constructing extensions or about figuring out how much wiggle room you have in the comparative or constructing frameworks.
I think it's really useful because, there's a difference between being able to think of an argument and being able to present it in a rhetorically powerful way. And that second step is obviously what is lacking for a lot of new debaters. So yeah, that's really good. Question in the Zoom. Yeah, if you want to just.
I think we can get. Yeah, I think we can get that.
You happy to answer that now, Daniel? Instead of, I think we can just do it as we go.
I think that's good. Sorry,
otherwise
my
at the end
was cutting out.
Yeah. Did you want to unmute yourself to ask it? We're very happy to roll with whatever.
Hello. Hi. In our debating society, we are facing the problem of elitism, basically in the sense that people from metropolitan cities who are fluent English speakers and have public speaking experience tend to join DEPSOC, and that creates mainly two problems. One is that people who tend to become well-performing debaters are usually people who fit this description. And what this means is that even for beginners or people who are considering debating, the people who they may look up to do not look like them. So that becomes one problem, because that makes it difficult for us to attract people outside of this description. And the other problem is for pro-am tournaments, wherein say the beginners are of equal capability or have very little difference. So pros tend to team up with those AMs who are part of their friends circle or come from their school. So, and this is a problem we've been facing for a couple of years, and it's worsening. So, what could be ways to address this?
Daniel, do you want to have a crack, or do you want me to?
I'm happy to chat first if you like.
Yeah, go
so
for
obviously there's a couple of aspects of those questions. So I'll just go through them one by one. And if I've missed something, just let me shout. So obviously the first bit is, how do you increase representation for people who may have pre-existing structural barriers, either financial or language or previous debating ability? How do you get them involved, make sure that they have fun? And a corollary to that question obviously is, how do you break down elitism or the clickiness in terms of the social dynamics in friendships, which obviously manifests itself particularly in the pro-am circuit, which can obviously just like magnifies those previous inequities. So if I've missed anything, just feel free to click something in the Zoom. In terms of increasing just your ability to make an activity inclusive for everyone, I think having those big group activities is really key for those people coming in, because obviously being thrown into a debate with another beginner, that's a very confronting experience. It's very like aggressive, because you're being compared to other speakers, you're having your shortcomings displayed. And so having a bit of room for people to be able to hide a little bit while still engaging and learning about those activities is really key. If there are specific groups that you're having trouble reaching out to or engaging with societies that cater to those groups. So for example, there are Māori and Pacifica law societies in New Zealand that cater to Māori and Pacifica who are quite underrepresented debating law students. Reaching out and running these activities for their members as a way to, hey, we want to teach you public speaking, we want to teach you this, and then using that as a pipeline into debating or increasing the representation like that is particularly useful. Obviously, you can't magic out of nowhere senior debaters who are suddenly representative. So it has to kind of be an ongoing project. And to some degree, it's not going to be ideal until you've broken that glass ceiling, until you've been able to develop those institutions. But I think this is how you start building those baseline building blocks of how are we going to make these first activities welcoming and inclusive to people who have less of a debating background. And that's about taking these quite abstract and confronting topics and making them accessible concepts and making them like quite accessible to people. Jess, do you have anything to add to that in particular?
I'll maybe go through the whole thing and I'll sort of think if I can add anything at the end.
Yeah. So I think the second part of the question then was specifically with the pro-am dynamics and the social dynamics. So the first thing is it starts with the norm among your executive members. So obviously, if your executive members are behaving in cliquey ways, that sets the tone for the entire organization. So you have to be quite firm about setting those norms with how do people on the panels engage, make sure that they're talking to different people at clubs night, they're introducing themselves to different people. In an online environment, what we've found is quite useful is using breakout rooms quite aggressively. So when everyone arrives and you're having like a social function, literally just randomize the breakout rooms. People like, okay, everyone's going into a breakout room. Going to meet the people in there. You're going to have at least one executive member in each room who has an obligation on them to meet those new people and start reaching out to them. So that's how you start breaking down those social distinctions between people. In terms of pro-am specifically, I'm really glad you asked this because this is a problem that plagues me consistently. There is a network effect where people who are popular as AMs obviously get better pros, and then that reinforces the cliquey cycle when they just become better by being introduced to people who are better, and like that's how it runs. So we have a couple of ways of dealing with it. The first is leveraging your informal networks like your exec members, and just set an expectation for exec members that when they go to pro-am tournaments, they go with people who aren't part of the already inner cliques. And you just say, sorry, when you sign up to be on the executive, that is one of the prerogatives that you'll do. You will attend at least 2 pro-am tournaments with people who otherwise would not receive development. And then you have tournaments like Auckland Rumble. And the way that we set up Auckland Rumble this year, specifically to, and last year specific, which is, sorry, Auckland Rumble is my university, University of Auckland's major pro-am tournament. And so it's attracted a lot of people from across Asia and Australia. And what we do specifically there is within the Auckland squad, we essentially randomize who's allowed to go with who. So you don't get a decision about as a pro about who you go with as an AM. It's literally up to the luck of the dice, and you will, by God, make that a nice experience for your AM, or you will have the wrath of a very annoyed development officer on your tail. And we also break it down into multiple categories of development. So we have people who have broken at international majors only being able to go with people who are very new to debating, who don't have schools experience, who aren't the already like an elite of beginner debaters, who have to go with people from the mid. And essentially what that does is just disrupts the pipeline, a little bit of unfairness, where very good older debaters go with the best AMs, and that just reinforces the privilege that they get there. And we offered the option to teams, to squads that were attending, that they could either randomize or they could pick their own internal allocations. Some of them took us up on the randomization. Some of them decided to allocate their societies themselves. And giving opportunities for people to mix and match with other, not on the social level, but in the pro-am level, and facilitating that process yourself. That's, I think, is really key to breaking down those social dynamics. But unfortunately, you can't force people to do any of this stuff. You just have to set good norms, and you have to tell them to go with other people.
So Daniel, if I'm understanding the Rumble structure correctly, so you basically had, like, let's say the highest, most experienced had to debate with the least experienced. And then there was kind of like 2 intermediary categories where they debate with each other, and then they break in separate categories. Yeah.
So essentially what we did is we had your traditional pro and dividing line, and then we just created a category of people who were better than your average pro, and the dividing line we used, it can change depending on where you are, is whether you have broken at a major, And then we also created a category within AMS of people who are particularly new, and those are people who haven't attended any minis themselves, or only attended one mini. And then we had the two categories of we had the blue category, which was the very good pros with very new AMs, and then we had the intermediate or gold category, which was the intermediate pros and the intermediate AMs. And essentially just what that did is it made it much easier for people who are new to debating to have a really good first experience, but also addressing some of the fairness problems that that you get when the favorite schoolie gets to go with the best speaker of your society, because that's just the way tradition operates. It breaks down that elitism narrative and says, hey, all of these people's experiences are useful and good, and usefully, almost everyone then also gets to break. So I think there's no reason to curtail the break in terms of not in terms of pro-am development tournaments. If you can break it into multiple categories of performance, there's absolutely no reason not to have multiple break categories and ensuring that people can get out-round experience as well. Because people should not be heaping their prestige on how well they do at a pro-am tournament. It's a pro-am tournament. It's designed to help people learn and introduce themselves. In fact, at Auckland Rumble, we didn't even release the tab. So that was a clear norm that we have in New Zealand. All development tournaments are not about speaker scores. Those are an unfortunate byproduct of the fact that you need to rank people somehow in order to break them appropriately. But that's not something we need to disclose to you at all. Feel free to talk to your judges. They'll be quite open and honest about their feedback, but it's about developing you as a speaker and making sure that every single person, no matter about their pre-existing debating ability, has an equal chance to get the foot in the door for development as people who've gone through the pre-existing and quite elite structures that obviously exist at the schools level.
I would probably just add a couple things, and then I reckon we jump back to finishing up the exercises. And if anyone has any specific questions about those, we can answer those before we move on to the last part. Just to add to the question, I'd say, it's obviously very difficult, right? There's no silver bullet. It is a difficult thing to do when that culture exists. Some of the things that I think are sort of also useful, building on what Daniel said, is just that I think if you can make your debating society's culture not just about debating, it really can help, because then, maybe at the end of the day, some people may just never be the most successful debaters, and that's fine. But if you make it about their contributions, the social vibe, the fact that they can be a good convener, or just anything else, I think it means that those people are more likely to stick around. The other thing is, I think, to really highlight the success of people that have come from those less privileged backgrounds or without a history of debating in high school. I mean, again, at the risk of sounding self-serving, I think a lot of people liked knowing the fact that I came from having no high school experience, and it was 3 years before I even broke at my first tournament. And I think hearing that is very helpful for people, because it helps reassure them that, it just can take a while sometimes. And further building on the pro-am sort of tournaments, any way you can vary, the types of tournaments that your society hosts, whether it's all novice competitions or pro-am competitions, I think will hopefully help further foster that sort of environment. But look, there is obviously no perfect solution, but I think hopefully all the tools can kind of gradually work towards there. But anyway, glad some of those thoughts have helped. I can see in the Zoom chat. But anyway, back over to you, Daniel.
Nice. So the second to last thing we'll discuss before we jump into pro-ams is just what are some activities you can play with older debaters, more experienced debaters, or they can just implement into their own training regimes. I don't think debaters take advantage of exercises nearly as much as they should. If you look at any sport in the world, they use them widely, and debaters are like, no, the only way I will practice at the sport is to play full matches of it. Obviously, that's just silly. So here are 3 things that you can either introduce your more advanced speakers to, or incorporate as part of a training program, or just if you are a more advanced speaker, something that you can implement in your own debating practice. Three fun things you can do. One is efficiency games. I think increasingly, and especially for BP, debating is all just a game of efficiency. everyone is very, very smart, but it's about being able to explain things in a way that is durable and dense. And that comes down to how cleanly and clearly you can express fundamental debating ideas. And essentially what efficiency games are is taking a point that you've made in a previous debate, or you've sat about with a bunch of friends and thought about what are important parts of the point. And then you make the point in a minute. So just like it was part of your speech, like, and the first point I'm going to make is this point. Here's the context you need to know about it. Here's the mechanism. I'm going to explain what's going to happen. And here's the impacts, which are clearly world-ending and wildly inflated for the benefit of the judge. And essentially what the point of the game is to make that point that you make and the key parts of the argument that you identify after each time being, and this is why it's fun to play with like other people, be like, okay, what do you think after hearing that 1 minute version with the most important parts of the point, the context, the mechanism, the impacts. Then you give yourself half the time or 3/4 of the time. So instead of making it 1 minute, you have to make it in 30 seconds. And then after making it in 30 seconds, you have to make it in 15 seconds. And after 15 seconds, getting it down to 1 to 2 sentences. And really what this exercise does is obviously focuses your ability to make points concisely. So just that training that muscle that allows you to take all those ideas and really churning out the most specific part of them, but it also starts to expose the skeleton that exists beneath arguments within debating. Because when you actually break it down, proving things to people kind of follows relatively predictable patterns. They're not necessarily patterns that can be universalized. There's no universal formula, but there's specific ways that you present arguments and things that you think are important that it's actually good to think about. It's like, wow, I'm spending too much time talking about the context of things, not enough time walking through the mechanism that leads to the impacts, or too much time really inflating impacts of things, not enough time explaining the context that is necessary to make effective mechanisms. So it starts attuning you to where the gaps in your by the fact that it increases the time that you are able to do it. Second fun game. Okay, this one, honestly, I don't know if I should call it fun. It really depends on your own personal tolerance for pain in debating. And this is no notes speeches. Yeah, I like it, but for some people I hate it. And it's giving speeches without using any notes. And it sucks sometimes because you're like, wow, I'm so dumb. I'm so inarticulate. I can't make these points nearly as nicely as I would want. But that is the point. It's about increasing the raw processing power and your ability to pull together arguments in a way that is clean and clear while having very little time to think about or put it together. And once again, it focuses you on the skeleton of arguments. So if you know you have your point title and that's all you had, you're going to make a point about how prohibition increases dangerousness by decreasing consumer willingness to call out bad practices or something. You know, you need to give them some context, you need to give them a mechanism, and you need to explain impacts. Just having those concepts in your brain gives you the point some semblance of structure from which you can build, makes you familiar with those basic building blocks of points. We have a style in New Zealand debating called Officer's Cup, or New Zealand impromptu style, where you get 5 minutes to prep for the debate. So obviously it's incredibly quick prep time. And obviously, honestly, you sometimes speak with very little notes. I was doing practice today. We have the tournament next weekend, not this weekend, obviously. We'll be at the tournament with all of you, but the following weekend. And that is also a useful style of giving yourself very little prep time to think about things, and then forcing yourself and forcing your brain to be able to churn out usable, possible arguments that obviously won't be the same quality as the arguments you normally pull out, but will be clear. And here's this is probably the most painful parts of doing no-note speeches. You force yourself to listen to the speech after you have made it. And this will be truly like nails down the chalkboard of your soul kind of stuff, because you will hear every flaw of your speech, every like silly repetition or vamping you were doing while you're desperately trying to think of the next part of the point. And it will make it clear what your crutches and habits are in a way that just leaves you nowhere to hide. So it's an activity that is good for stripping back your debating style and really exposing all of the things that you need to work on. And I think that's the final activity that I think is quite useful. I record almost every speech I give at every tournament, and I force myself to listen to them at least once. And then sometimes if I do a particularly bad job giving that speech, I will make myself give it again. this is just good for cementing all of the stuff you hear in feedback. You will obviously get an enormous amount of feedback over the scope of your debating career. Forcing yourself to actually do it again and do it better is the most useful way of actually making that stuff stick. So record your speeches, tell all of your squad members to record their speeches, tell your squad members to give that speech again if they were unhappy with it. And they'll start really uncovering the patterns or crutches within their arguments that they think are flawed.
That's a lot of discipline. I wish I had done that.
Yes, lots of fun.
Yeah.
It also means sometimes when a DLO or a DPM decides to just burn your entire extension with no warning, you can at least survive giving an extension speech with no time to write things down. Yeah, I'm sure that will be familiar. Sorry, question about note taking.
Yes.
Don't take any notes, clearly.
So I am mostly an improv speaker. So when I do make notes, they're usually A, illegible. B, when I make extensive notes, I tend to not I'm not able to speak properly. But also when I'm not taking notes properly or I don't have anything written, it's almost as if it feels like inconcrete, like I almost fear as if I'm about to miss something, or like I'm going into like a space completely blank. So how am I supposed to go about like with this improv style of speaking and note taking?
Enormously familiar feeling what you're describing, I think, for most debaters. Before Jess, you have a chance to answer, I'll just show you this. This is just a sheet of paper that I have from a debate I did today. And as you can see, this is pretty illegible. This is like random ideas scrawled behind, with lots of listing, lots of numbers. I think numbers help give me structure, and it's all allocated in a rough positions on the sheet of paper where I know roughly what type of thing is coming. And what I want to really highlight is often what you write down doesn't become necessarily what's in your speech. You'll have lots of those incomplete feelings and incomplete moments. But the great thing about doing no-note speeches or forcing yourself to engage in impromptu is it teaches you how to fill those gaps. And so instead of seeing the incompleteness on your piece of paper as being something that is a flaw, instead you see it as an opportunity where you in the moment can produce a far better point than what you were able to produce during prep, because your brain has had that little bit extra time to really process things. So just by doing this activity and feeling awkward and having all of those gaps within your speeches, just doing that a couple of times by yourselves will make you more prepared for the moment that happens during a debate. So in many ways, the pain there is the cure. You just force yourself to do that activity enough times. You do enough of the no-note speaking, you do enough of the listening back, of the efficiency gap, to start identifying those basic building blocks of debating and really hammer them into your head. That'll give you the foundation from which you can give way more fluent speeches. Because it's not about not having gaps, it's about being able to fill those gaps when those gaps arise. Yeah, sorry, Ron, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I'm not going to turn on my camera because I just woke up and I'm still lying in bed. But hi, everyone. I'm Ron. I'm one of the other CAs for this competition. I wanted to chime in here because I have a completely different note strategy, but I think to what Daniel's showing you. And this worked really well for me because I have ADHD and I have trouble focusing on like large quantities of information at once. This advice will not be well received by the more environmentally minded of you, but my strategy was just to use a lot more paper for my notes. So what I would do is in like literally like a Sharpie, and actually quite literally a Sharpie, I'd have 4 different colored Sharpies, color coded according to whatever sort of like, usually red was rebuttal, sometimes blue would be like framing or engagement with a different team, whatever. But I would have like one page with just in giant scrawling letters, I would just have like the headline of an argument. And then underneath it, I would write like the rebuttal that was going to be integrated into that, or you know, like the one specific point that I knew I might forget to say if I didn't. But that meant that as I was flicking through, it would force me to impose structure into my speeches, because I was physically like moving to the next part of my case by turning it over the entire like paper and then reading out the headline as the next argument I was going to make. And because I was summarizing it in like just the headline of an argument and then the few critical things that I was going to say, and they were big and easy enough, I could just glance at my sheet and see that like short sentence that I'd written, and I mean large because I was really scrolling this stuff at like covering a third of a page. So for me, that got rid of the barrier, firstly, of like trying to impose structure on my speeches from a single sheet of notes, because now I wasn't just reading as I go down. And secondly, it meant I wasn't having the difficulty that I think you were alluding to, which is your speeches end up sounding very stilted and very sort of mechanical if you are just reading the notes that you wrote earlier, or indeed even having to divert your attention back to your notes from staring at the panel. I could just quickly glance down at whatever sheet I currently had on top, and there would just be in giant red letters like why this is more important than privacy or something like that, and that would be the guidance for my speech. So if you're currently writing all your notes on one sheet of paper, or maybe just 2 sheets of paper, try expanding that out into like 10 sheets of paper, and you may find out that that feels easier to like process or to engage with without disrupting the flow of the speech as much.
Do you find though that, like, I find the problem with me doing that is that I then can't sort out all my sheets of paper before I give a speech. So like, how do you do that?
That is a very good question. I stand there sometimes up to 30 seconds shuffling all these sheets of paper. Actually, that becomes part of the practice itself. I mean, there's like difficulties and benefits of every style of note taking. Usually I'd be like in prep, I'd write my framing or my witty intro, and then I would just like slap that down, face down on the table at the beginning. And no, I'm not going back to that, but that part's probably not changing. And then, well, I don't give whip speeches, so actually the order was something like plan ahead a lot of the time. With extension speeches though, sometimes the order would get a bit messed up, and halfway into my speech I'd realize, oh, hang on, this was meant to go near the beginning, and that's fine. Like, judges should be judging holistically, but yeah, shuffle the notes, like get them into the order before you start your speech.
Yeah. So I think what this kind of should show everyone is that, you know, that there are different styles that are going to work for different people. And I think it's a bit of trial and error. And I've certainly tried different approaches throughout my years and just found eventually what sort of works well for me. It's probably somewhat of a hybrid between what Daniel said and what Ron said. I also use colored Sharpies because I need like things to stand out to me visually on the paper. So yeah, you got yours there. So anyway,
I always just use 2 colors. Anything else confuses me.
So does that sort of conclude that part of our, Ron, you're welcome to stick around for the next part, of course. We're going to talk about pro-amming.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, I was just going to say there that I don't know if you guys, because I missed the first minute, so I don't know if you guys caveated this, but I always feel like it's important to clarify that there is no right way to debate. There's no right way to prep. There's no right way to do anything. And you should remember that at every debating seminar you attend, you will hear often contradictory advice from different people, and you should just pick the one that vibes with you, rather than sort of going, this skilled debater has said this is now the canonical truth of how I will debate from now on. What Jessica said is absolutely right. Trial and error.
Indeed. All right, Dan, do you want me to kick off or on this bit? So just thought like some really quick tips about pro-amming and also kind of debating with different people. My sort of main observation is that you gain a lot of different skills from debating with people at different skill levels. So I think the obvious benefit of debating with someone that is better than you is that you will learn about strategies and arguments that you could not have thought of before. The obvious benefit of debating with someone who's less experienced than you is that you're kind of forced to, you can no longer have the kind of, you know, the safety net of knowing that the person who's better than you will think of, you know, the extension or whatever, all things failing. You are forced to kind of do that heavy lifting. And then I also think there's actually a benefit in debating with people who are on a similar level than you, because you sort of have to match their energy. You're, you know, if, you know, you might be wanting the person that wants to, you know, come out on top on the speaker tab, and I think it pushes you in a different way. But in that context, obviously, pro-amming is particularly important, and this is just a few things about if you are a pro in that situation. The first sort of tip or observation I would make is that not everything in those environments will be about the win, right? It can be very tempting as a pro speaker to be like, well, if I don't give the extension and it doesn't come out clear, then everything's going to fall over and we're not going to get the win. So I'm going to speak that, right? But, you know, maybe your AM would really benefit from doing the extension speech, and that is something that you should give them the opportunity to do. And maybe you can do that more if it's a less, you know, stressful competition or an internal or something like that. That also applies to, you know, maybe in prep, it would be a lot easier for you to just do all the talking and dictate the case to them. But and maybe that would be the most strategic thing in getting the win, but it may not be the thing that's going to develop that AM. So I think just take a moment to step back sometimes and remember when there is that trade-off, and when, you know, it's not all about the win. Sometimes it's in the long term is going to be best for that person's development. The other thing I would say is, again, very obvious, communication is key. I think try to get a sense of what your AM wants out of it. Do they want that competitive experience? Do they just want to develop? Do they just want to have a good time? Knowing that, I think, will help poise you really well in advance. You know, and if they are one of those people that just wants to win, then maybe they will be totally fine with you just dictating the case to them and kind of doing whatever will position you most strategically. But have that understanding in advance, so there's no kind of misunderstandings, and that you know, obviously vibing together. And I think that'll just make for a better cooperative team environment. And the final thing is just to kind of, I think there are a few things that, you know, as people who've been debating more often, we, in our minds, we will say an argument and we will just assume that other people know what that argument means, right? Like, oh, just run a, you know, oh, I can't even think, but, you know, some generic argument. Oh yeah, you know what it means. Obviously, for a novice, they may not know what that means. So I think some helpful tips when you're prepping can be things like ask them to say that argument back to you in their own words, test their understanding and make sure it is there. If you feel like you want to involve them more in the prep process and they're being a little bit quiet, you can ask them some sub questions to prompt their thinking, such as, you know, what would be a really good example to demonstrate this argument, or something like that. And the final thing is just, you know, don't be afraid to give feedback as long as it's positive and constructive. I think novices will appreciate that. But sometimes to make them feel less bad and, you know, so they know that they haven't let the team down, I will couch it in things that I could have also done better. Like, yeah, I think you could have probably gone through that point a bit efficiently, but hey, I also did that. I also missed that argument, and I probably could have rebutted that point a little bit more comprehensively. So they realize that everyone is capable of improvement. It's totally fine. So those are just a few things that I wanted to talk about with pro-amming. But anyone else? Daniel, Ron, wanna?
So I would add two things. The first is you really need to explain why not to run things. The immediate temptation when you want someone not to say something is to quickly move on from it and hope they don't run it. But that is never going to be the effective work. If you have not fully explained why an argument will not work, it will come out in the speech that is then given. And taking that moment during the debate just to fully explain why their idea, the strong points of their idea, but then why you think it's not something that should be run within the debate, will help them understand it, as well as, of course, improving the performance of your team in general. And the second thing I'd say is that pro-amming is not just about introducing them to your debating abilities, it's also about letting them leverage off your social network and your ability to interact with people. So if you know friendly pros and you're in the same room with them, you set the tone in terms of making sure that they engage in the norm of talking to other teams after their debate, seeking feedback from other debaters who are better than them. And I think what's useful there is to swap AMs, just to have one pro go to one AM and then the other pro come to the other AM. and then vice versa across the room. And what that I think that really teaches them is it lets them ask questions. Why did you phrase your extension like this? What do you think you could have done better in terms of your whip? Wow, the adjudicator really roasted you guys about your framing there. What would you like? Those types of discussions are incredibly useful, but also it allows them just that little bit of social interaction that makes them feel more comfortable in those debating circles, and hopefully they gain another friend who they can go and bother with random debating questions when those debating questions pop up. It gives them lots of options, and that's exactly what you want to be providing for your AM.
I have a funny story about that first one that you said, which was, I wasn't really a pro even at this point. I was still relatively novice, but I was speaking with someone who was even substantially more novice than me. And it was a debate about like providing just cash transfers to people in the developing world versus like engaging in development projects. And in prep, he was like, oh, if we just give them money, they'll just spend it on PS4s. And I was there like, no, don't say that. That is not a reasonable argument to make in this debate. And then we proceeded on to prep. Now, the problem was he was speaking speaking second, he was speaking deputy, and he ran out of material about 6 minutes into his speech, and he began explaining that this was a bad idea because people in the developing world will just waste their money on PlayStation 4s. So what Daniel said about explaining, not just saying don't run that, but explaining why that might not be a particularly good argument is really important, because otherwise you're
We have all got stories like that.
Did the adjudicator buy the PS4 argument? I hope not.
No, and also it was one of those, and if anything, it was one of those really frustrating situations where an otherwise sensible case becomes very easy to dismiss because one part of it is ridiculous. And if you're whoever wrote that comment, that's genius. Where one part of your case was quite ridiculous, and then the judges were like, well, there was a close clash here. Now it's really easy to dismiss you guys. Obviously, judges shouldn't do that, but it's irritatingly common. So I learned a valuable lesson, which is for pro-ams, explain why arguments shouldn't be wrong.
So we will just chat for a little bit longer. If you have any questions, please flick them into the Zoom.
We have a question. Feel free.
So I wanted to ask that in debating societies, we usually have a priority of obviously winning tournaments. And so there's usually, there's like, it's either you develop as the entire society, or you prioritize teams. Like you have to produce like an A team, and then a B team, and then a C team. So you prioritize making the best team, and then they would be able to have like a trickle down effect of making teaching their novices. So what's better, developing together and the environment that will create? How will novices come to that kind of a society? Or developing a single team, and how does that affect kind of having an admirational kind of thing, or having like a stepping stone for the novices to come in? Also, I just wanted to show what an environmental hazard my case sheets were. So yeah,
I think your handwriting is a lot nicer than Daniel's. Well, that's a tricky question, isn't it?
Significantly.
I mean, look, I don't have a clear-cut answer. I think it kind of depends on what resources your society has in large part to leverage. In theory, it is nice if you can bring everyone on the journey, not just because that could be the better way to develop, but because it's just sort of inherently more equitable. Like, but if you've got, for example, pressures facing the society, your university's asking you to produce a certain number of results, and you've got finite resources, and for some reason that kind of lends itself to focusing on a select group, I can understand that would happen. I think whilst maybe not ideal, if that kind of has to happen, I would just kind of almost impose, what's the word I'm looking for, like sort of expectations, like, okay, you know what, we're going to give you this money to go to this tournament and you get the A team status, but what comes with that is an expectation that you're going to give back to the society and you have to do X number of things, and you can rely on goodwill to do that. That sometimes works. Other times I've seen societies impose things like, you know, you're only going to get your reimbursement for this tournament after we see that you've done X number of trainings for the club or something like that. So that is maybe one way of doing that. But yeah, I don't have a perfect answer, but I think it is a tough balance, and it largely depends on your priorities and your resources and your expectations. But wherever possible, equitable distribution and sort of focusing on people is great. If you can't do that, then I think at least impose some sort of expectation for how people ought to give back after that.
I think I do have a slightly, well, it's an example-based answer, but my society was one that was not particularly competitive. We were doing okay at the sort of small regional competitions, but there was certainly no expectation anyone was going to go to sort of major, whether that was Euros or Worlds, and break. So there was no realistic pathway where we were going to have, or at least it didn't seem, and it ended up, me and my partner ended up doing quite well, but to start with, it didn't seem like we were ever going to be a massively competitive society. And so the kind of internal decision that was made there was, it's way more important that people want to come back and are enjoying weekly training sessions, and more importantly, are enjoying the competitions, because the best way for people to get better at debating is that they keep debating, obviously. Sorry, I know that this is tautology, but obviously what I mean by this is, pick the approach that the majority of the people in your society agree with and are having fun with. And if that means like people are just continuously pairing up with their friends, as long as it doesn't become cliquey. Obviously, that the discussion that was had there, I think, generated a lot of very useful advice. But if two people just enjoy speaking with each other, let them keep speaking with each other. That means that they'll keep coming back, they'll have a good time. Creating a good social environment that keeps people coming back also then means, creating a good, like, healthy social environment then means that, you know, when the next year's intake come along, they see a big group of friends hanging out and having a good time, whether that's at competitions or at the weekly training sessions, and that makes them want to be a part of it and so on. And obviously then this creates a virtuous cycle, hopefully, where more people are joining a society, more people are going to competitions, and a lot of this stuff will end up resolving itself naturally. So I would say, unless you're already at the size where you and have the sort of quantity of experienced people where you can realistically start focusing resources into an A team that will achieve the big successes, that will, you know, attract people towards seeking that pathway to glory, just do whatever is making the individual members happy.
I think that's, yeah. Daniel, you're not too tired?
Very late. I've had a gorgeous evening though. Thank you for joining me.
So I have a question. Like, I think I have two questions. So number one, like, our university is going to have an internal pro-am tournament, and a lot of these new debaters, they have never debated before. They haven't had any experience with public speaking whatsoever. They are usually like locked into a rut of getting as many marks as possible, studying nonstop and extra. So, and also, like, for them, the competition part of it is very intimidating. Like, you know, even if we tell them a lot of times that it's okay if you don't get a first, like in BP debating, it's okay, second and third is also very good, and all those different things, they are going to get intimidated by that. So do you think it's a good idea, it's a good idea to, like, for example, to not make the competition as competitive, like, for example, like announcing the top 4 to 5 speakers rather than having a finals or things like that? Do you think that's a good idea? And also, secondly, as my second question is that, so in my experience with debating, it's like you like, as you get more into it, all aspects of your life like kind of like merge with it, and you just, like, you know, like you just like kind of think of it, like you start becoming more obsessive about it, and that can sometimes result in just a certain kind of like a pressure being there before tournaments, or just generally like, mental health or just like, or those things that, like Tanya talked about like making sure that the experience is good and wholesome too, those things becoming unconsciously less important. So like what are some ways that you think, like, that practically, like, that can be avoided a bit? I don't know if my question is clear or not.
Yeah, your question is very clear.
Why don't we start with the first one and then, yeah. I mean, I think like Auckland Rumble was a good sort of example on sort of how maybe some of those competitions can be less precious. Like I think not publishing a tab is a really good way of doing that. I mean, whether to have finals or not, I'm not sure. I think that's a trade-off. Like, some people, you still want to, like, debating is at its core a competitive activity. So I don't think you can shy completely away from that. But I think whatever you can do to sort of, like announce a top few speakers, but don't publish a tab, or what else? I'm trying to think. You maybe if people are, you can always like play with formats. Like if it's one of those competitions where people are like struggling to give 7-minute speeches, you might cut down the speaking time to 5 minutes or something like that. Just any tweaks you can make to kind of accommodate the group of people that are likely to be at the tournament, I think is useful. Anything else you guys want to add on that?
Yeah, I'd say have sessions before the debate starts. So similar to what I was talking about with how you structure just like a clubs night, where the debating aspect of it comes after a little bit of time for them to warm up into the activity and also chat to people in a more mellow scenario. So say, for example, holding like a workshop before the debate begins, where essentially you play a bunch of debating games, get people hyped, fired up, teach them that it's not just about being shitty and tearing down each other's ideas, but also there's like quite a beauty in finding extensions and like messing with extensions. It's not an inherently aggressive activity. It's quite like a geometrical activity. Giving them that appreciation for debating, I think, is quite important. And then the second thing is stomping on people who are mean. I mean that, like, not don't actually stomp on them, but like set the cultural norm. Get your exec members to rein it in if they're being a little bit too sharp. Have quiet chats with more experienced or advanced debaters, and make it clear what the tournament's about. Of course, you can also make divisions. If you're worried about the mismatch, I think that there isn't. I personally don't find there's a big problem when you've got lots of people who are the similar level. The problem comes about when you have mismatches, and people really throwing their debating weight around. You can either fix that normatively, or you can fix that by changing some of the structures of debating and splitting into multiple divisions. Say, for example, you can take people who've just begun and then have a 5-minute speaking time cap in order to make it a little bit more accessible for people coming in. But there's 100 different ideas, and also you've got lots of time to experiment. But hold some events a little bit before the actual debates begin to give people that time to warm into things.
Anything else you want to add, Ron?
Could you suggest some good individual techniques to improve debating? Yes, I can suggest them, a lot of them. I think that might be a topic for another few sessions. But for example, if you go to the Auckland Debating Facebook page, there's a whole bunch of development seminars covering lots of different aspects of debating, similar to the way that we've chatted tonight. But the individual games that I recommended in the middle are good ways to start putting into practice some of the individual techniques that can improve debating. So no-note speeches, recording and listening and redoing speeches, and the efficiency games. Speaking in front of the mirror, I don't think so. Your image is distracting. Just speak in front of the way you normally speak and record your voice. I don't think speaking in front of a mirror helps.
The rationale behind the speaking behind the mirror, as I understand it, is to see you have a very obvious signifier if you're doing distracting hand movements or whatnot. I agree with Daniel there. I think that this is bad advice. It's way too distracting. Have to stare into the eyes of
No
yourself
hand
as you give a
movements.
speech.
Also, no hand movement is truly distracting. It's just expressions.
True, 100% true.
As an
To return to the previous, oh, sorry.
Oh no, I was going to say, as an Italian, I agree with that. Yeah, definitely.
To return to the previous question about competitive pressure, identify where that if you think that pressure is becoming a problem, the way you described it is that people are sort of beating themselves up for not performing well at competitions, if I understood the question correctly. I think people compare themselves to the people in their proximity more strongly than anything else. So if they see that there are teams in their society that are continuously, breaking, topping tabs, whatever, and then they're not, then that's probably, I imagine, the most common source of anxiety over people not doing well at competitions and scaring them into not going because they feel like they won't live up to that standard. If you have any control, or if you are one of those people who's doing continuously well, goof around a little bit. So my novices saw me going to competitions and deliberately running cases that me and my partner just thought were funny, and happily yeeting ourselves out of the break because we were quite clear about the fact that most of the time we were there to have a good time, and we cared a lot less about making sure that we were the number one team. And therefore, I think I probably made a lot of the novices feel like they had less pressure to continuously break and continuously perform because, hey, even the guys at the top of the society aren't taking this that seriously. And obviously, this is not something you should do continuously. It's a serious competition, and it matters to you competitively. Don't do this. But if you have those smaller regional competitions, just goof off a little bit, and that will make people more comfortable about not doing great, I think.
And look, I've said I think everything I have to say about competitive pressure and mental health in the piece I wrote, which was shared earlier, but I'll repost the link. People feel free to personal message me about this if they have any comments or questions, but I'll repost that here. So yeah, Facebook page has all the debating exercises. Oh, that's Daniel's Auckland Debating Society. Yeah. Yes.
Another really good resource that you I don't know if it's is the Astana Debate Union YouTube page. Has lectures on a huge number of different topics now. Actually, Jess, you gave one, right, on law?
Indeed, I did.
Yeah, so maybe link that, because obviously that's well known in the European circuit because Astana hosted Euros this year, but it may not be globally as well known that resource exists. So if you just go on YouTube and search Astana Debate Union, or maybe someone can helpfully post the link. I'm on my phone right now. But that has tons of great YouTube lectures.
Question? Yep. Go for it.
Okay, I just shared the Auckland debating seminars. There are 20 something of them.
I was so happy. Yours truly was invited for one of them. It made my day.
It's great.
We had fun. It was good.
We did.
I'll post the. Does anyone ask? Oh, great. Oh, and the other thing is, if you have any other questions, you just post it to Debate Serious Posting, and between Ron and I will race to try to beat the other one to answer it, I think. So that's always fun. It's always a fun way of getting answers. Jokes. Okay.
Oh, you were joking? Oh, I thought I'm deadly serious about
that. It is. Wait, no. How late is it where you are, Daniel?
So I don't live in Australia, so I have the pleasure of it being 2 hours later than Australia, and I want/need to go to sleep. So I will bid you all adieu. Thank you for an excellent experience. I will see you tomorrow or the next day. Or whenever time zones mean that our next session is.
Indeed. Bye. If anyone's got any final questions, well, it's 12:20 a.m. here, but I have a 1 a.m. Video conference. So unfortunately, I'm still going to be up for a little while. And it's Ron's morning, so you're fine.
I mean, technically afternoon, I just have a sleep schedule. Well, the word
True.
schedule maybe is not appropriate.
Fair. Any final questions, thoughts? But otherwise, yeah, I guess this is going to be, oh God, Daniel will hate me for saying this. He's going to kill me. I don't care. He didn't ask, I'm saying this. Daniel has applied for Belgrade DCA. And if you thought anything he said was a bit useful, maybe you might want to give him some feedback. I don't know. Just a thought. He's going to kill me. But anyway.
I think he'll forgive you for improving his chances of being a world CA somehow.
Totally. Yeah. A small question. Go for it.
Hi. So when in a tournament, when you from a university has to debate on a theme that is supposed to be what the other team is studying. For example, I am debating on a economics motion against a team that is pursuing MBA. So what can be a smart way to approach debates in this? Because if you make a tiny mistake in your analysis, they can just pull you over that and just give you more facts about and disprove that part and take the debate their side.
Oh, I have a really pertinent answer for this, and it goes to the question of style, and the fact that most people don't know that style is actually incorporated into debating. So if you go and read the World's Judging Manual, or the speaker briefing, I think it's just combined into one document. There is a section that talks about the impact of style, and it uses economics as an example. And what that example is basically what one team says, this will lead to material deprivation in the lowest decile of the population, or something like that. And then it says, and then there's a second statement by a different team allegedly that's like, this will cause a large drop in income for some of the poorest and most vulnerable people, limiting their ability to purchase the essentials that are required for them to survive. Analytically, those two statements are, functionally the same thing. But as the manual says, the second statement is more understandable to the average informed voter, or whatever it's called in your norms. And so that second statement should be taken both not as derivative if it was an extension, but also as more persuasive. Economic students in particular suffer from throwing massive amounts of terminology and jargon, and hoping that this impresses judges sufficiently into giving them the win on the motion that they, just by demonstrating the sheer scope of their knowledge. Point out that is not persuasive, and that the terminology that they've used in this, like when you're responding to them ideally, or in a POI or whatever, point out that the terminology that they're using, or the high-level spec knowledge that they're throwing around, it does not cohere with arguments targeted to the ordinary informed global citizen, and therefore are not considered persuasive. Or just say that in the way that is most comfortable to you, because if they're winning on the use of extremely technical terminology, they shouldn't be winning.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would also add, I think, you can always, pretty much any debate you can reframe to be about something that you were able to talk about. So maybe, the debate is about X economic policy, and, the team's claim is that it'll, the economy will develop, or some crap like that, right? But if you're, if you just flip the metrics of the debate and be like, look, maybe that is true, but, this causes X harm to people, which is, we cannot quantify it, but it is pretty significant for these reasons. You can obviously just make the debate about something else, or a principle, or anything really. The other thing is, when teams have specific factual claims in the debate, the other thing you can do is just, I guess, if you have any kind of structural reasons which are underpinning your case, it can be helpful to kind of re-emphasize those and sort of suggest that, look, maybe, they're just saying this fact, it could be right, it could be wrong, we really don't know, it's very technical, so the average reasonable voter probably can't discern this, but what is intuitive is, this underpinning rationale that we give you, even if their fact happens to be right, what we know is, and then kind of defer back to that, I find is sometimes helpful. Yeah, what I do is forget the debate. And
in terms of reshifting debates into more principled ground, I think an effective way you can do this, and this applies to a lot of different types of debates, is to illustrate that actually a lot of these institutions that we've set up are not utilitarian, just maximizing the net I don't know how to explain utilitarianism. Someone say in the chat if that's not a term they're familiar with. Jess, I'm sure you can come up with a different way of saying it. But most institutions in society aren't actually utilitarian. If the justice system was just about ensuring that, you know, the least amount of crime happened, then we wouldn't have the standard of, you know, beyond reasonable doubt. We would lock murderers and, you know, sexual offenders up indefinitely, because the risk of them reoffending would obviously be unthinkable if all we want to do is ensure no crime ever happens. Similarly, in the economy, we wouldn't have welfare for people with disabilities. We wouldn't have, you know, subsidies for sectors that weren't economically, you know, maximizing efficiency or whatever. We don't structure society in a utilitarian sense. And if this one team proved that, oh, well, this will, you know, produce some sort of utilitarian net increase in income or something like that, that shouldn't be something you should prioritize. And instead, here we can talk about why this harms a particularly vulnerable group of people or violates some right or some principle that we think you should value. And that initial perspective shift of, no, you shouldn't be thinking about this through, you know, the traditional which side produced the biggest impact or whatever lens, can be a way to get back into the debate, or to shift the debate onto turf where you can make principled arguments, even if on the face of it the debate seems like it shouldn't be about principles or whatever.
But yeah, don't worry, I've been there. I know nothing about economics. I've never won an economics debate knowing economics facts. Never. So I just make it about something I know about. Yeah. Maybe any other final questions, and maybe we'll wrap it up.
I do have a question. It might get a little bit long, but just please bear with me. So people like us who have some sort of exposure or experience with debating, we have the luxury of being surrounded by friends, etc., who think along the same lines as us, or are generally more progressive, have more progressive views regarding especially things like gender, sexuality, religion, etc. But well, in our own country, and when we're recruiting new people, a lot of those people don't think along the same lines as it often becomes necessary to think about when it comes to debating, in order to avoid any equity violation, in order to be just generally have better, more logical arguments. Sometimes thinking more progressively becomes important. I just wanted to ask if you have any suggestions for how to introduce people who don't have any sort of like background on actually studying gender, feminism, or how exactly to teach them to kind of disregard certain cultural or religious opinions they might have in order to debate a bit more progressively, if that makes sense.
I can have a go, can have a stab, unless you have any thoughts there. I mean, look, my kind of observation is that debating can sometimes be problematic in that it does kind of sometimes assume by default that left-wing ideas are like correct in the debates. And I actually don't think that is a good, you know, default way of, you know, it works insofar as, yeah, like human rights are important, for example, but like when it comes to talking about like economically conservative positions, or just like, you know, certain assumptions around more conservative ideas, like maybe like I don't know, for example, I'm struggling to think of an example, but I think I would sort of reject the idea that we ought to default sort of unless it's about just general inclusivity. I think that, to my observation is that it is a bit of a trick in debating, and something I don't know what the solution to it is. But I think debating can be very confrontational. Like the norms in which govern debating are so different to, like, you know, a lot of, maybe less so at university, but, you know, like half my friends, like we do gender pronoun introductions, right? Before all debates pretty much now. Most of my friends outside debating wouldn't know what the heck that is about, right? So I think the key is to just, you know, introduce people to those concepts, but don't, you know, people might stuff those things up. They may not get it right. They may not understand it straight away. I think it's just about explaining things in as non-confrontational way as possible. Just being like, look, these are the norms of our circuit. And, you know, I understand it might be a little bit different, but, you know, just kind of explaining the rationale. It's about, you know, there's so many different people that participate in debating. It's about making it as an inclusive and welcoming culture as possible. But I agree it is a little bit tricky. And to be honest, I don't quite have sort of the experience coming from Australia, obviously, it's probably a different kettle of fish to, any other country. So not the most sort of clear answer there, but that's just a sort of collection of rambly thoughts.
No, thank you so much.
I think that there's a variety of different issues incorporated in what you asked. One of them, I think I have no idea how to address, which is if someone comes from a religious background, debating, it's pretty secular, I suppose, in the sense that we sort of have to be independent of the perspective of religion, because that's not a sort of overriding universal thing for the whole world. So I don't know how to answer that one. But in terms of some of the other ones, I think a lot of issues surrounding like feminism and gender, sometimes the answer is like the explanations are really hard to fight back against. So I don't know why, but for some reason, and it happened to me a bunch of times, when the equity briefing would be happening, for some reason people look at me and they seem to think that I might be willing to agree with them on mocking things like the pronoun policy. So people would turn to me in the announcement hall and be like, oh, isn't this dumb? Complete strangers. I don't know why this happened. Anyway, my answer was, it's so easy. It takes like 30 seconds at the beginning of the debate. And if someone there doesn't want to use the pronouns that are associated with their visible gender, and that makes them more comfortable, why are you not willing to take 30 seconds to just make that part of the round and just make someone a little bit happier? And the reason why I think this is effective is because I really doubt that they have a good answer prepared for that. Most of the time people live in, bubbles of ideology, and sometimes just asking them, why not, is an effective way, because, debating is supposed to teach us the art of dialogue and of exchanging ideas. And sometimes rather than trying to just like tell someone this is how it is, sometimes that's necessary, as Jess said, sometimes you just need to get people on board with the norms of your circuit or your society or whatever. But other times just have a discussion with them. There's probably some reason why they hold that view, and there will be reasons why you hold your view, and through discussion, if like, I think it's pretty trivially easy to explain why it's important to, for example, have a diversity of representation in terms of genders, because optically, if people see that all of the best debaters in their society are men, women who join are just going to be thinking, oh, that's not something I can accomplish. So explaining that to people, just saying, look, we have affirmative action because we want these people to feel like they can succeed too. Basically just chat it out with them. And if they can't hack that, then I don't know, maybe debating is not going to be a great experience for them because it's not going away. I agree that progressivism probably shouldn't be the norm, but it is, and that's unlikely to change. And if they can't handle participating in debates where they're going to have to conform with that, they're just probably not going to have a good time with debating.
I guess maybe the only other thing I can add is just that wherever possible, I guess you can refer them to kind of like the formal guidance that exists in place. So they might be thinking like, well, like, why the heck is this the assumption in the debate? If we're talking about actually arguments in the debate, refer them to concepts like, in the world's judge manual, like the average, I forget the term, reasonable, intelligent voter, global informed citizen, whatever the heck the term is, kind
Someone
of
really needs to harmonize that.
Yeah, I don't even know. So I always forget. But that kind of establishes that, the reason why we, maybe in debates assume that, I'm just making an example up, but maybe the reason why in debates we assume that climate change exists is because the average reasonable, whatever, would probably think that, and so on. And there was just a final question in the chat about like debates of other countries. How do you sort of go about, like, I mean, yeah.
I'm going to put it in the chat. This is like the #1 free resource that covers global politics, in my opinion. And this is good because it will, American and bizarrely British politics. I found that international competitions, people seem to know weirdly large amounts about internal British politics. Anyway, CFR.org, I'm pretty sure that's the address, covers all global politics, including, the big ones like America and the UK and I don't know, China, but also, but it's as a resource is like one of the best, I think, for global politics.
That's a good resource. It might also sound a bit counterintuitive, but I find that I remember more facts about countries and things by doing a debate on them versus reading something on them. And obviously that doesn't help you if you're trying to prepare for, you know, when you'll get the topic on that thing. I think the way to overcome that is like, you know, for example, you don't have a lot of US politics knowledge. Ask someone to set you a practice debate topic about a US politics topic. You'll kind of pick up the arguments by what you can come up with in prep, but also what other debaters, like most of the time I just like will see an argument that another debater does and I will remember what they have said, and then that will stick with me more than reading an article about that thing would. So that's another tool, but unfortunately there's no simple solution. It is just a lot of reading. Maybe if you don't like reading, find a good podcast. I don't know any, but I'm sure some exist. Cool. All right. Any final questions? I might have to run, but it was fun.
In terms of, actually, I have one podcast suggestion on this just before we go. It's called The World Next Week, and it's two guys. It's also run by CFR. I'm a big fan of theirs. It's basically just two guys talking about like upcoming political events around the world and kind of discussing the background of them, what they expect. So, you know, if a big summit's going to happen, they'll talk about, you know, the issues that have led up to the summit, the sort of what's happened between different world leaders recently, etc. And it's a bit fun to listen to because it's less like didactical. So them telling you this happened and this happened, this happened. It's more about them sort of speculating and, you know, discussing. And therefore, I think it's quite fun to have. It's quite fun way you just throw that on in the background while you're cleaning or doing homework or whatever.
Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
Yeah, I couldn't see the chat while I was talking, so I could just see everyone suddenly laughing. I was like, oh God, what did I say? The Delta thing was mostly for fun, but also because I dislike the way that, because tone policing and debating annoys me. And people are like, isn't it annoying when people use that word? I never use Delta. I've never said it once in a speech, but I find it really annoying when people are just mocking other people for the way that they debate, given that debating's already overloaded with jargon that doesn't exist in the real world. Why are you bullying people for this one new one? If people want to use Delta, let them use Delta. Plus, I think it is actually a pretty useful concept, but
all good, all good.
You'll never hear me say Delta in a speech, although I may. If I end up doing it reflexively during the show debate, you're all welcome to mock me incessantly.
Okay, final question, and then I really do gotta run. It's just about matter files. I find that I don't use them in debates because like you've only got 15 minutes and just like digging through the right thing can sometimes be time consuming. What I do find matter files more useful is actually the process of compiling them before the tournament and how that information gets retained in your brain. So then you're not actually, it's not about finding the information, you know, in prep time itself. It's about what you've digested prior, but obviously you can do that in whatever way works best for you, such as, you know, the aforementioned news articles, podcasts, whatever. That's just me personally though. I think it really depends on the person.
I will say that I think this view is quite widely shared amongst most successful debaters. I can't think of anyone I know who's like done really well consistently who uses a matter file in debates. I know lots of people who compile, as Jess said, compiled one before. You know, they spent the time reading and writing up their thoughts, but that was more of just like a memorization process, I suppose, than actually intending to ever go back and look at that in prep. Because yeah, prep's too short to be reading from a matter file. And also sorry, there is one exception to this, and the reason why I never use this is because I happen to just have a reasonably good memory for like random names and places and numbers and stuff. But The only matter file that I would recommend making is a card about major countries that come up in debates, like small little flashcards basically that say, here is the capital city, here is the current leader or leaders if it has a sort of multi-pronged governmental structure, here is like their number one export, the language they speak, demographic, stuff like that. Because saying, I don't know, Angela Merkel proposed this last week, it sounds more like you actually know what you're talking about than saying the German government proposed this last week or whatever. But yeah, broadly speaking, I think most top debaters don't use matter files. So that doesn't mean you shouldn't if you find them useful. But if you are currently using a matter file as a crutch, try and move away from that probably would be my suggestion.
Maybe. Wouldn't be surprised if Harish did that. Anyway. All right. Well,
Harish has this theory that there's only 7 types of debates or something. I can't remember in which video he talks about this, but I'm not sure I agree.
Fair enough. All right. Well, hope everyone found that useful. And if you have any other questions, feel free to message us. We'll be debating tomorrow night anyway. Ron will be doing another workshop on Thursday. So plenty of, and we'll see many of you at the competition this weekend anyway.